Good afternoon and welcome or welcome back to the David Rumsey Map Room. It's great to see you all in for the long haul. My name's Karen Wiggin.
My name's Martin Lewis.
And we decided we wanted to just very briefly and informally introduce our keynote speaker for this last session of the day. Barbara Mundy has been here before. She has spoken in this room, knocked our socks off, so we thought we wanted to have her back. Barbara Mundy is a historian of art, and we've heard so far today from a political scientist or political theorist. We've heard from a couple of anthropologists, and we thought it's nice to swing over all the way into the humanities now.
Well, you know, geography and art history are considered very different fields, but there's a lot in common. Every beautiful map, and there are many beautiful maps in this room, are also works of art. And I think, as Barbara will tell us, there are also many artists who work with maps and do interesting things with them. And so I think the overlap is large and to be encouraged. Also, Indigenous maps showing Indigenous peoples in the Americas are very interesting as well. At one point, I decided to do a project on this. It was one of those aborted projects that never went anywhere. But I was looking at historical maps, trying to see how many were portraying Indigenous states in the early modern period in the Americas, and not many. The one that I found in a number of apps were the Mosquito people of Eastern Nicaragua, because they had the British recognized their kingdom, partly because they were in alliance with them against imperial Spain. But otherwise, the absence was really pretty extraordinary. And so I think we're going to get an important corrective to that.
Well, I will admit that when we invited Barbara Mundy, I was imagining she might do an extension of the kind of work for which many of us got to know her, which is this kind of mind-blowing interpretation of Indigenous cartography from the contact century. But instead it's, well, you can all come to your own conclusions, but my impression is that what she's doing in a way is flipping the perspective and provoking us to look at the European imagination of Indigenous sovereignty or lack thereof as expressed in visual images. So in a way, and there's some analogous dismissal of Indigenous sovereignty to what we heard about in Monk's paper this afternoon, but in a different medium and maybe with slightly different results. But we just think that she has written such a beautiful self-introduction in the biographical resume that you can all have access to at the back of the room. We're not going to read her resume out loud. So without further ado, Barbara, would you like to take the mic?
I want to acknowledge that I wrote this paper when I was on the unceded lands of the Lenape people in New York. And I want to acknowledge their present in the past and their continuing presence and the contributions of Indigenous knowledge to our own knowledge systems as I begin this paper. When I was invited to this conference over a year ago, little did I or anyone really imagine how central conversations about sovereignty would be as we watch the unfolding nightmare day after day of Russia's invasion of the Ukraine. From our 21st century perspective, this is a clear case of the violation of Ukraine's national sovereignty. We accept as a key principle of sovereignty as the power of a governing body to operate within a defined territory, both in theory and practice. And the map has played a key role in its visualization. Here, territorial integrity is fully visualized by sharp, color-coded borders of cartography. Cartographic visualizations, in turn, have helped us to make sense of the violations to national sovereignty. Here's a New York Times map of the location and the force of Russian intrusions into Ukrainian territories. And looking back over the history of the 20th century, we can see vividly the role that maps have played as national sovereignty has been decided at the negotiating table. Here's a manuscript map, for example, from the papers of Woodrow Wilson, showing the proposed frontiers of the soon-to-be created Poland. Unless we forget the contested nature of national sovereignty from the same files exactly and from part of the same decision-making process, here's a map of the pre-war period showing the political subdivisions of what would become Poland, as well as its linguistic areas. Sovereignty based on linguistic communities was superseded by a new national map, but continues to haunt the region today. Now, as historians of cartography, we're also aware of the cartographic presentations of the sovereign the cartographic presentations of sovereign nations are Janus-based. They look back in time and they look into the future. They have a history from which they derive their authority. And they also project forward into the future, giving form and body to aspirations or desired states. Here, for example, is an early 20th century map of the Russian Empire. You'll immediately notice, particularly when I show you the geo-corrected version, the westward position of the Russian border. That's what that map looks like today. Circulated through printing, promoted in atlases, cached in historical archives, maps like this one became embedded into national histories and into national imaginations. When Putin claims that he is simply restoring Ukraine to its rightful place as part of Russia, historical maps give shape and substance to his argument. Certainly, sovereignty is a practice happening in the moment, on one end of laws exerting the order of the state, and on the other, the advance of tanks to claim it. But it also exists in the realm of representations, as we heard nicely from Jordan Branch this morning. And it is through representation, often cartographic, that national sovereignty expresses both its imagined past and its desired future. We've been invited today here to think about remapping sovereignty. And as my contribution to this issue, coming from the vantage of an art historian of Latin America, particularly indigenous communities of the present-day Mexico, I'm offering a talk of 3 parts. In the first part of the talk, I want to sketch out the origins of the associations of the territorial map with political sovereignty, well before the rise of the nation state. And as we'll see, it has everything to do with Mexico. We'll return to the moment in the early modern period when European monarchs, particularly the Habsburgs, were consolidating political sovereignty over scattered and contentious states, royal sovereignty of the period being its precursor to today's more familiar national sovereignty. It's 1521, and the invasion of the Americas and the fall of the Aztec Empire gave Spain's Habsburg ruler an unprecedented and unexpected territorial reach. Necessary to the royal consolidation of sovereignty was the dispossession of indigenous monarchs and their sovereignty in the Americas. In the second part of the talk, I'll turn to the enduring memory of the linkage of territorial maps to indigenous dispossession made by European publics well into the 18th century to highlight the crucial element of indigenous dispossession, the setting of indigenous peoples and their claims to sovereignty as out of time. Since maps, as we all recognize, are imaginative projections, albeit ones based in a visual language that proclaims their authority, it's worth taking time. It's worth taking the work of the imagination in map making seriously. So in the third part of this talk, I'll turn to the work of 2 contemporary artists, Sandy Rodriguez and Mariana Castillo de Val, who are deploying the powerful language of cartography and using it to imagine new projections of indigenous sovereignty. Part 1. Our expected point of origin for this enduring marriage might be at the end of the 15th century, when nautical cartography and instrumentation entered a period of growing technological sophistication. Developments in printing allowed for a wide dissemination of maps. Spanish and Portuguese monarchs competed for sovereign power across the globe. Famously, in 1493, Pope Alexander VI granted territorial sovereignty to the Catholic monarchs of all lands laying 100 leagues to the west of the Azores and the Cape Verde Islands, a land giveaway that was later modified in the 1494 Treaty of Tordesillas. But no map was produced as part of the agreement to document or to visualize these important sovereign claims. Instead, it was 25 years later when the union between cartography and sovereignty, in this case, royal sovereignty rather than national, became firmly established. It came with this map. It represents the great Mexica or Aztec city of Tenochtitlan, today Mexico City, in the months of 1520 before its fall to Spanish forces in August of 1521. At the left is the island city, and around the edge of the lake are other cities shown at smaller scale. Historians estimate that the region may have had a population of some 250,000 people, equal to Europe's largest cities at the time. It's not just one map, but it's two. And along the edge, there appears here a schematic map of the Gulf Coast, signaling the territorial expanse of the empire ruled from Tenochtitlan, the city at its center. This was also the coast that Spanish forces under the command of Hernán Cortés had landed the previous year. Now, the woodcut map was created in Nuremberg to accompany the publication of one of the letters that Cortés sent in 1520 to his monarch, Habsburg Charles V, ruler of Spain and recently elected Holy Roman Emperor. This letter, called the Second Letter, described the marvels that Cortés had recently encountered in the then autonomous city and Cortés's fateful meeting with its emperor, Moctezuma. Cortés, in this letter, recorded a speech that Moctezuma delivered to him, which I show you here in a Spanish original and English translation. In this speech, Cortés claims that Moctezuma gathered his lords around him and made this statement. I'll just read the part. He said, "You may henceforth hold and obey this great king," meaning Charles V, "for he is your natural lord, and in his stead hold his captain," that is Hernán Cortés, as his representative. Setting the question of the facticity of this speech aside, its rhetorical value was immeasurable, because it neatly answered the question of whether Charles V actually had any rights over another sovereign emperor, Moctezuma, or his kingdom. Also crucial along with this purported transfer of sovereignty was that Moctezuma made Cortés a gift of a number of maps. One of them may have been the prototype for the one that you see on the screen. The gifted Aztec maps then served as a kind of visible token of Moctezuma's territorial possession. When passed from the Aztec monarch to Cortés and then sent to Charles V, they concretized the promise of Moctezuma's speech and the transfer of sovereignty to Charles V as the new and rightful natural lord, to use the framework of the day, because Charles held the map. This woodcut, whose prototype was made when Tenochtitlan was still autonomous, was probably in the process of being engraved when news reached the printer shop in Nuremberg that Moctezuma's successor, Cuauhtémoc, had surrendered and Cortés controlled the city. Too late to rethink the design, the maker added the Habsburg banner at the top of the map, along the center line of the page, to assert the new arrangement of royal sovereignty. Then a new text was added to Latin at the top of the map. It reads roughly, and you can see it's in a different typeface altogether. It reads roughly that while Tenochtitlan was a great city at one moment, it was now under the domain of the, quote, imperial Caesar, that is Charles V. The connection between map and imperial sovereignty, first established by Moctezuma's recorded speech in the Second Letter, where the map served as a token of seamless imperial transfer, was then reiterated in the text set upon the map. The engagement between map and royal sovereignty was thus first presented to a European public, and the life of this map was greatly extended as it circulated in various iterations, as we'll see, for centuries. I describe this map as an engagement between map and royal sovereignty because the terms of that relationship hadn't quite yet been worked out. Royal domains were still often scattered, and monarchical power was inconsistent within domains. Moreover, the rights of natural lords, upon which sovereignty was based, was still under debate. It was only later that nation states would provide the fixed boundaries to create the familiar cartograph. In order to neatly visualize royal sovereignty through the map, at least one cartographer drew on medieval theories of the king's two bodies. One of these bodies was mortal, but the other transcendent, containing divinely invested sovereign rights. This notion of the conceptual and enduring body of the monarch was a useful conceit, allowing mapmakers to combine figuration with cartography. Johannes Pucht's 1537 map, Europa Regina, was a tentative attempt in this direction, here shown in two later versions. Here, all of Christian Europe is imagined as a woman, an image rooted in what Elke Anna Werner has described as the powerful tradition found in medieval political theory of the unity of all Christians. When imagined in the later 16th century, when Habsburg control was entering into its peak, Spain wears the crown, but Bohemia is the heart. This somewhat radical experiment in human cartographic figuration did not endure into the 17th century, in no small part because of an inherent tension introduced when figuration, one mode of representation, is introduced into cartography, an entirely different mode. When forced into the same space of the sheet, they become imbricated and impossible to disentangle. This clash of figuration systems, as Christian Jacob points out, turns the space they represent into an impossibility, a geographical paradox. Moreover, and I think more importantly, the map demands our eyes trace every curving river and protuberant mountain. Such visual activity is not the normal inspection of the royal body, or more importantly, the female royal body that it should allow. Mapmakers thus resolved the awkward relationship between figuration and cartography by the end of the 16th century by largely removing royal bodies from the map space. Their figuration instead was safely contained in the form of the portrait, which could be set off in the margins as an independent iconographic system. And in this case, Queen Elizabeth's body is encased in such elaborate clothing, ruffs, crowns, as to be visibly protected from the viewer's potentially probing eyes. As for other figures, though, map makers would transform the foreground space of the map into a kind of stage onto which to display the particular peoples, eventually changing from a bird's eye view to an oblique one to better coordinate the two spaces. Yet maps of American cities, figuration continued to be associated with some kind of sovereignty. This is clear in the reworkings of Cortez's map across the 16th and 17th century, sometimes to accompany a new edition of Cortez's letters, but sometimes in a totally different context. Here, for instance, it appears as one of the great topographical atlases of the 16th century, Brown and Hogenberg's Civitates Orbis Terrarum on the screen. On the left side of the map, we can see Mexico City. We can see Mexico City based on the Cortez map. As you can see, flipped along the vertical axis, but it's clearly recognizable. In the foreground of the map, as well as on the facing page of the on the facing map of the former Inca capital, Cusco, the mapmaker has set figures into the stage-like space. because of their feathered crowned heads, they're positioned on elevated litters under palanquins. They are presented as native sovereigns. Crucially, though, they are never named, and their temporal status is ambiguous, as is that of their cities. In this case, the absence of any European figure within the cities that were then part of the Viceroyalty of New Spain or of Peru, respectively, makes it clear that we are looking at a past era in these maps. Now, across the 16th and 17th centuries, the Cortes map was reworked, gradually transformed into an oblique view, and then pulled into service to represent the city as it was in the present, even though elements of the map, holdovers from earlier Aztec Tenochtitlan, had long since ceased to exist. You can see this series sketched out here, and I'm going to concentrate on the map in the lower right-hand corner. It's the last of the series. It was published as Vetus Mexico in 1671 by John Ogilvy and Arnaldus Montanus. The title of their volume leaves little doubt that we witness it as a present-day city, America being the latest and most accurate description of the New World. In the foreground of the map, its contemporaneity is asserted by the figures in European dress of their time. The hatted and caped white figures in the right foreground, the carts pulled by oxen in the background, and the dark-skinned figures who labor under their heavy packs or rest from their exertions. Now, publications of Ogilvy and Montanus's had wide circulation, particularly among elite European readers. And we know that from the number of translations and editions. But what we rarely glimpse is the way that such images and their framing discourses were received and made sense of. 2 years ago, a curator at the Lewis Walpole Library at Yale contacted me about an unusual item in their collection that was related to the Cortes map. And because of my interest in the map, she sent me this particular image. So this is a really crazy image. I'll take a little time explaining it to you. So this image was occasioned by the British craze for extra illustration. If you've never heard of extra illustration, you are not alone. I had to run to the reference books on this one. It means personalizing a printed book by interfoliating images in a volume. In this case, the volume that it comes from was Borden's copy of Seeley's edition of Horace Walpole and His World. While conventionally to do extra illustration, you'd read a book, you'd be attracted by one of the figures in it, let's say Charles V. You'd run out, you'd find an illustration of Charles V, you'd carefully prepare it, and then you'd rebind it in with a book facing the mention of Charles V. So every extra illustrated volume is a unique, personalized dish. It's a little different than a scrapbook because extra illustrations are really carefully done and they're really carefully bound in, so they literally become part of the book. It's a very laborious process. In this case, the image illustrates, the text illustrates just the passing reference to Mexico. Walpole is one line about Mexico in one of his letters. However, it clearly excited the reader's imagination, who saw fit to add a collated image facing the text. The image's interfoliation in a book published in 1884 has allowed it to survive in pretty much pristine condition. To make it, its creator cut out and pasted down an already existing etched map showing a roughly contemporary view of Mexico City onto a sheet of paper. The creator then framed it with a scene where he or she painted imagined inhabitants. You can see the painted surround here because it is a slightly different brownish tint. And here is the map cut out there. That's a different, so that's the map cut out, and the rest is painted. I think that at the time they were made, the creator was not intending to use a brown ink. It browned over time, so this was a seamless creation. So the painted surround was intended to extend and to add to the map's imagery. In the background, though, you see a version of Ogilvy and Montanus's roughly contemporary map of Mexico City, which you'll recall was billed as being the latest and most accurate description of the New World. But in adding the two prominent figures in the left of the map, the illustrator transformed its temporal frame. One of them is a, quote, Aztec warrior, as these exotic and temporally distant figures were imagined in Europe, and the other a male or perhaps a female figure carrying what, if anyone has greater insight, but it appears to me to be a handbag with a pineapple. These are not contemporary Mexicans, but they are equipped with visual signs of reality. They stand on real ground. They seem to be arrested in the middle of a chance encounter or a conversation. In other words, they are not allegories. Instead, this British creator outfitted contemporary Mexico City with images of Amerindians as they had existed centuries before. These indigenous figures are included in the map, but not as contemporary occupants of the city, even though there were many indigenous people living in the city, but they existed in some undefined but earlier temporal sequence, one where Aztecs wore feather headdresses and carried defensive shields. This is one potential source for the map, a Montanus edition of a description of the New World. And you can see some of the elements of the costume that have probably been drawn over in some iteration, as well as the striped clothing. The creator then has decided to overlay the city as a contemporary phenomena and instead map indigenous bodies out of time. They are set in an indeterminate past that hovers between the present day reality of the city in the background and a vague pre-contact moment in the foreground. Now, while this move could be just dismissed as a singular example done for private pleasure, I would not be so quick to do so. Because in selection and presentation, the nameless creator offers us a rare example of how Cortez's map was received and what kind of imaginative response it triggered, a history of reception. And while this may be a one-off, it is also the considered response of a cultured and educated person living half the world away. We do not know, of course, the creator's identity, but a British creator would increasingly be likely to perceive himself or herself as sitting in the center of a newly expansive empire. And the collage augurs something being codified as the discipline of anthropology in North America, holding indigenous people as existing in some other temporal moment. So the powerful association first set out in 1524 of the map with sovereignty here comes to express an emergent ideology of Amerindians out of time. The moment these Amerindians are caught is never the future, but always the past. And in North America, we encounter versions of this even today with tropes of dead Indians or notions of primitive cultures that were popularized in the 19th century and still have great hold. I hardly need dwell on how pernicious such tropes have been in the effacement of indigenous sovereignty in the United States. The title of my talk is Indigenous Sovereignty Out of Time, and I chose it for two meanings. We've just seen the ways that historic maps, like the Cortez map, first established the link between cartography and sovereignty. Later figurations of indigenous bodies locate them in some ambiguous temporal space with their outlandish feathered costumes and antiquated weapons. Such figuration serves to make Amerindians both real but not of this moment. The title also could have another meaning as well, which posits indigenous sovereignty as literally running out of time. This indeed might be true in places like Brazil, where the territorial sovereignty of Amerindians in the Amazon is fast being eroded as the forest is being opened up for ranching and mining. Now, how might maps bring Indigenous sovereignty back into time, that is, address the coeval presence of Amerindians? Or how might maps be used to destabilize the seemingly inviolate sovereign claim of the nation made through cartography, itself, as I've argued, the inheritor of earlier modes of sovereignty? Two contemporary artists offer some ways to think about maps and mapping that confront both the immense communicative power of maps as well as the history of erasure of Indigenous sovereignty. Sandy Rodriguez lives and works in Los Angeles, and as a Chicana artist, she's long been interested in representing the history of dispossession, both historiographic and actual, of Mexicans, Mexican Americans, today and in the past. Rodriguez was an educator at the Getty Museum for many years, and today the Getty has a digital project to translate one book of the Great Florentine Codex, a 16th century book that has aptly been described as an encyclopedia of Aztec life. The bilingual text of the Florentine Codex, Spanish and Nahuatl, was richly illustrated by Indigenous artists whose images reflect the Aztec past, as well as report on contemporary events like the War of the Spanish Invasion of 1519 to 21. A recent work by Rodriguez, one page of a larger Codex Rodriguez Mondragon, deploys the familiar cartographic frame of the West Coast of California, but instead layers it with images that are drawn from the Florentine Codex, as well as images from her own invention. Along the Pacific coast, at the lower left, marvelous ocelot fish, recorded by Aztec artists in the Florentine, now swim, and the natural histories of the 16th century are transplanted to the present. In this work, the border, that defining feature of national sovereignty, has been erased. Instead, images of desert landscapes fill the space as if to make the point that the natural world of which we're all part has no frontiers like this, that they're all fictional. In another work, meant to protest the detention camps along the borders, Rodriguez mapped them in space, but also undercut the Indigenous out of time convention. Instead of showing Indigenous bodies placed in some ambiguous temporal space, Rodriguez drew on images of Aztec or Nahua women from the Florentine Codex here and set them weeping and crying. When I was putting this together, I realized that the site of the recent mass shootings is right there. So I think that Sandy drew these Aztec women to weep for the children in the camps, but they're also weeping for they're weeping for the massacre that just happened. It's here as if these people of the past are actively bearing witness and crying alongside the tents of the detention camps. In this work, the national border does materialize, serving as a road for the Indigenous peccary, also here from the Florentine Codex. While Rodriguez media, paper, ink, and pigment seems conventional at first glance, they're actually derived from a long history of Indigenous image making. For instance, Rodriguez often paints on fig bark or a matl paper, the traditional paper used by the Mexica or the Aztecs. And she collects and produces many of her own pigments, often by foraging in local semi-arid or desert environments, like the ones here, or uses traditional pigments from central Mexico. What I really like about Rodriguez's work is how she draws on the understood communicative power of the national map, but uses figuration to bring Amerindians, be they the Weeping Nahua, women from the Floridan Codex, or contemporary Mexicans of indigenous descent, into the same cartographic space. In her abundant images of the natural world that exceed borders, she also points to transnational and transborder phenomena, which we, as human animals, are all part of. Mariana Castillo de Val was born in Mexico City, although now she lives in Berlin. I came to know her and her work because of her engagement with historic maps. In 2013, she was asked to do a large installation in an art space in Berlin, for which she designed this work. It has several components. The floor has been covered with sheets of plywood, onto which has been engraved the Cortez map of Tenochtitlan. The map that we've seen was so important in making the connection between cartography and sovereignty. Poles have been set up into the space, and upon them are dance costumes. Other poles hold recreations of symbols that Castillo de Val discovered in ancient Mexican books. Why was she drawn to the Cortez map? I asked her. She responded that in Mexico, the Cortez map of Tenochtitlan is the kind of icon that you always see in textbooks or in history exhibitions. Since the map was made in Nuremberg, Germany, and was inflected by how Europeans saw the foreign and exotic Aztec capital city, when she was asked to do an installation in Berlin, it seemed to the artist a natural starting point for that exhibition. Now, in order to make the floor map, Castillo used a technology that is as fresh and new in our moment as the printed woodcut was in 1524. She made a digital scan of the image and rasterized it, and then fed that data into a computer numerical control machine. This in turn would engrave the lines of the map at a much aggrandized scale onto big planks of plywood. At this step in the process, though, the map image was very difficult to see since it was simply a network of grooves in the wood of the plywood. So revisiting the same technique that was used to make the woodcut image in 1524, Castillo inked the plywood boards and pulled prints from them. In this image at center, Anna Zaflarsky is shown here with one of the large woodcut panels, using a roller to apply the greasy ink in an even layer. At the upper left, Ayami Awazahara gently picks up a sheet of dampened paper from the stack. One pair of clean hands and one pair of dirty hands is the rule of the print shop. She'll bring it over to lay it upon the inked plate to create a print, later to be bound as an atlas. The drawing sheets from an early iteration of the same process are seen hanging like clothes from a line on the right side of the photo. Now, each print in the atlas is only a small portion of the entire map image, and it's printed in reverse, that is, black background and white lines instead of the original black inked lines. These prints render the map, so familiar after many encounters, into a frustrating object, as partial prints mean partial and mean withhold total knowledge. It's actually the opposite of what we expect an atlas to give us. If you're at the same time, if you're deeply familiar with the map, as you might be from repeated viewing, partial knowledge can stand in for the whole, the prints as synecdoche. For me, though, the synecdoche raised another question. What exactly is the whole that is standing behind the fragment? It's the kind of question about systems of knowledge and their representations that Castillo de Val's work frequently asks. The work also complicates the typical modes of figuration. The costumes that are set into the map are not those of Tenochtitlan's original inhabitants, nor are they some kind of imagined, quote unquote, Indian of the kind that we saw in the map of the Walpole collection. Instead, the costumes are those of chinelo dancers, a spectacle first performed in the colonial era. often staged during Carnaval, a time of role reversals. Residents of the modern state of Morelos would don masks and costumes and perform elaborate burlesques of their Spanish overlords. The Chinelo dancers continue today. In other words, the costumes are contemporary ones worn by members of communities who might identify themselves as pueblos originarios, given that the term indigenous or indígena is not commonly used in Mexico, nor are there federally recognized tribes as there are in the United States. For Castillo de Val, the costumes may be meant to contrast the plurality of contemporary Mexico alongside the way Mexico was first understood to exist as an entity or an object of knowledge by its cartography in the form of the Cortez map. The second complication to figuration is produced by scale. Castillo told me that she liked the idea of the viewer entering into the space of the map and that it drew attention to the play of scales. But this move means that a second set of human bodies become part of the map, at least for a time, they who are the viewers of the work. They enter into its space, they navigate around the indigenous presences that are signaled in the Cortez map by the costumes. Since the space of the map is not something separate from that of the viewer, there's no comfortable place to view the map that does not involve the movement of the body. Just to get the sense of bodies moving through space, I'm showing a separate map of hers that's a separate floor piece of hers that's done by the same process. It's not a map, but you get a sense of how you have to kind of enter into the space to see it, and you can't really see them from any angle. There's no viewpoint, which complicates our normal relationship to cartography. For me, walking on her maps is always a disquieting experience. First, because you're always told never to touch the work of art, but additionally so because walking on the piece involves some kind of desecration. There's the dirt from the bottom of your shoes that leaves marks with every step, and you leave your physical mark as you wander across the surface of this. Both these artists depend on the map's anteriority, that is, they exist within a host of associations as the starting point of their work. Rodriguez's erasure of the California-Mexican border resonates only because one knows of the importance of that border in defining where one nation's sovereignty begins and another's ends. At the same time, in asserting the natural world over the political order, she also suggests that nature's sovereignty might trump all else. Castillo de Val taps into the familiarity of the Cortez map as an object of spectatorship and as an object of knowledge in order to produce unsettling effects. So to conclude, art is not a political program, nor does it offer a history lesson. At best, it can offer a kind of estrangement from the normal order of things, allowing us to return then to that order with new eyes that allow us to see its fractures and its seams. In the case of these artistic works, they help me think harder about the close intersection between expressions of national sovereignty and, before that, imperial sovereignty, and the historical development of cartography. And they also denaturalized some of those associations, particularly between expected modes of figuration and the map. And as we look ahead, our familiar map of national sovereignty seems an outmoded instrument in confronting things like climate change, because weather pays no heed to national frontiers, nor does the resulting flow of humans seeking survival across borders. At the same time, maps are powerful tools because of their legibility and their deep-seated authoritative claims. Perhaps we can learn something from these artists in how to use them to imagine and visualize pluralistic presence and futures that are more equitable. Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. I knew it would be good. we've heard today a little bit about maps and affect. We just actually saw it. It's very powerful. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. The floor is open.
Hi, thank you for this beautiful talk. I was intrigued by that image in the middle of your talk, the watercolor, or rather the painting on top of the map. And I was immediately thinking of other possible sources that range from Chateaubriand's Atala, which could still be within the, let's say, its scope, but also operas on Moctezuma.
Yes.
And in that sense, it would really perhaps be a depiction of Moctezuma.
Yeah.
In an operistic setting. But at the same time, I was thinking of David Gerber's recent provocative book about the way that he claims, right, that indigenous chiefs filter it through Jesuit letters into basically the European Enlightenment as critics of, let's say, European sovereignty. So adding that sort of extra twist, that the possibility that by depicting an indigenous chief, even Moctezuma, it would be playing into this sort of very common critiques of European imperialism, etc. So those are just some ideas that your presentation made me think of. Thank you.
Thank you. That's really a wonderful point about thinking of those as critiques of sovereignty. For me, I mean, it's such a puzzling work because of its particular context in Walpole's letters of all places. Like, what are they? And I also suspect, just because of the particular imagery, the way it's painted, I think it's repurposed. I think it's earlier. I think it's an 18th century thing that then gets pulled into a 19th century volume. But it does, I think, to your larger point, it does speak to the ways that these tropes have such a powerful hold on a European imagination that they become repurposed over time. And because I may not ever find out the very particular context, I might never be able to nail down whether it's Moctezuma's opera. But I appreciate your point that all of this imagery, particularly at this point, Native Americans as being offering a critique of sovereignty is a very well taken point. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much for the moving talk. I was really drawn to this example of extra illustration. It seemed like a beautiful visualization of annotation for a map. And I guess the question I had was, what does it mean for an English reader in this case to be imagining the Spanish Empire to reify this idea of the ancient noble savage? Why an English reader?
Again, that's a wonderful question. I think one of the things that's going on there is that the English reader is probably, we don't know who that English reader is, but the English reader is probably thinking about new forms of empire, because if they're sitting in, say, London or somewhere near, they are increasingly aware of Britain as being at the kind of the new hub of a newly constituted empire. So I suspect that one of the things that might be going on there is thinking through empire as bringing all these strange bodies into the space of Walpole and his letters. The problem, though, again, is one of temporality. It might be an 18th century version that's repurposed in the 19th century, which makes it difficult to even figure out who that illustrator is, who that fictional person is. But it was clearly somebody who was thinking broadly about this. And I love that it's just so crazy and serendipitous that it's coming out of Walpole's letters. They found the Cortes map, and this is what they're thinking about. So I don't know, I think there are a lot of question marks around that map, and I don't know they'll ever be able to answer them, but I think that's well taken. This is being created in a British context, a British contact where empire is ascendant. Thank you.
Thanks for the fantastic talk. I was intrigued by by all the maps, but particularly by the one that you showed that was created in this by this artist, and I forgot the name, in the Berlin studio.
Yeah.
And I was wondering, what role do you think does perspective play for this kind of cartography? If different from, for example, the physical position of the spectator in the map and with the map, so the materiality of this three-dimensional map. I was just reflecting on, it's not a very clear question, but I was just wondering, I don't know if you had any thoughts around that.
Can I pull that image up? Just so that we know what we're talking about? Yeah. Oh yeah, sure. Yeah, go back there. You can pull it. Yeah. That's. Yeah, this is. I think the one you're thinking about is. Yeah, that's. You can hit that. That's hit there. This is what you're talking about. Yeah. So, I think for me, what is unsettling about this is that she's almost enacting the great story of Borges's map, where the scale becomes so big that you can't even see it anymore. It becomes useless as an object of knowledge. And that's one of her real interests, is the way that knowledge gets represented. And her works of art are often pushing at that boundary when knowledge is actually comprehensible and when it's not, and when it's so abstract that it dissolves, its comprehensibility dissolves. And so in this particular work, the scale of the map, which you can kind of see here, is so big that you literally can't see it anymore. And of course that makes us incredibly aware of the way that diminution in maps is part of their legibility, but it's also weirdly fictive. It's giving us a space that's outside of ourselves while we are existing in the three-dimensional space. When you enter into this maps, you collapse that distance between you as the viewer and then you as actually the occupant of the space. So they think that's another thing that her map is doing. These 4 pieces are doing. I love the way she's playing, though, because the Cortez map, of course, is such an important map, literally because of the technologies of print that were ascendant in that early 16th century moment. And the reason we all know this map is, well, we know digital version, but it survived in many, there are lots of editions around because it was a big print run. And it was reprinted again and again. And I love the way that her work kind of pays tribute to those original forms, those original technologies that made this so visible. It gets us to reflect on like what those processes mean as well.
Thank you so much, Barbara, for that beautiful talk. The really fascinating discussion of the contemporary artist's work made me rethink the Cortez map. And I'm thinking about that map as also a dialectical map with Indigenous notions of sovereignty maybe within it. And I'm thinking specifically of Sandy Rodriguez's, in your reading of it, of the sort of nature trumping lines, and thinking about the sort of cosmogram tradition within the Cortez map. And I mean, you've analyzed, the Fehervary-Meyer Codex, and thinking about, the importance of the water within that. And I wonder if you might reflect a little bit on that map and not having only, the sort of Indigenous side of it, and it's, a potential reading of sovereignty or lack thereof through space.
So let me pull that one up because it's such a. So So in this map, I think what we're seeing, if we think about it as coming from the Mexica prototype, is that we're seeing an idealized vision of the world in a circle, in a circular form. We know we have maps that are, have radial symmetry, something like this one. And I think that some of those mapping tropes are getting picked up and made invisible, even though they're perfectly visible on the surface, but they're made invisible because of the printing process and because of literally the lack of interest in that kind of knowledge transfer. And what was, I wrote about this map a long time ago, and what was so striking to me is how much, if you're trained looking at Indigenous art, there's so much in here that seems like straight from an Indigenous kind of playbook. But European viewers, I think, never even saw that. They didn't have that visual vocabulary to do so. So I'm not sure if I'm answering your question at all, but I think that what recent historiographic trends, and your own work, Marcy, has been really a leader in this, has been thinking about the ways that systems of knowledge are literally constructed on Indigenous epistemologies, but then by the same token, they abstract those so that they deny the existence of those foundations. And I think this map is a perfect example, as kind of starting point of that way. And again, it points to the developments in the historiographic field right now of literally rethinking these natural histories, this way of thinking about space, and acknowledging the fact that there is this profound amount of Indigenous knowledge that goes into them that then through colonial processes becomes erased and effaced.
Thank you. Wonderful, stimulating talk. I want to ask you more about that Florentine Codex, because the pictures are so poignant and so beautiful. The fish and the women grieving. So who did that codex? Can you tell us more about it and its illustrators?
Sure. This is the Sandy Rodriguez. I'll just pull up the grieving women. So the Florentine Codex is a 3-volume book. It was created under the auspices of a Franciscan friar written in the 1570s. And he had a whole team of native intellectuals, Nahuatl speaking intellectuals who were working for him. Many of them were trilingual in Nahuatl, Spanish, and Latin. He had a host of artists who were working on that book. And the book itself was the response. He drafted out a set of questions to ask them. And the book is really their responses, and it covers everything from pre-Hispanic deities to pre-Hispanic history. And the last book, which should be required reading in every high school across the land, is an account of the Spanish conquest of Mexico, told by these Indigenous intellectuals who themselves had not lived through the conquest, but who were the inheritors one generation removed of the history of the brutal conquest of Tenochtitlan. And that book is preserved today it's in Florence. It was sent to the Medicis as a gift. And it's been digitized as part of the World Digital Library collection from the Library of Congress. And it's been translated into English. There's a wonderful English translation. And the Getty Initiative Project, they wanted to do all 12 books. Just pull that screen up. They wanted to do all 12 books. It's a momentous undertaking. Right now, they just have one book, the last book, the Conquest book that's up. This page that you're looking at is from the 11th book, and it's the natural history. And it's modeled roughly on kind of a Plinian, from Pliny's view of natural history. But all of this, and Marcy Norton has written a lot about this, so she can probably talk more, but much of this knowledge about species and plants and animals is coming directly from these Indigenous informants who are illustrating what they know, and they're writing about all of these species. You can actually see in this page, if you read Spanish, And you can read small.
Thank you very much for a really evocative and thought-provoking talk. I was really sort of struck, captivated at the end when you talked about, the possibilities of these recent, one might say, art cum cartography projects to liberate the geographical imagination a bit, beyond the sort of conventional map of states. And I started thinking, are there reasons for optimism on this front that we can find historically? And this is not very well thought through, but I was sort of thinking about, the age of decolonization, where there were artistic projects that maybe started to open up a bit the imagination of how the world could be figured differently, and that might find their way. I don't know if this is the case or not, but into cartographic projects even that might help to kind of advance that idea, or if there's any thoughts you have about some way in which we can get a little more optimism around what I think is actually a very provocative point at the end of your talk.
Thank you. Well, we're lucky we have Bill Rankin here, because I'm sure that you can address some of the new visualization. But I do think that cartographic visualizations, the cartography is still full of such power. It just hasn't gone away. And although as historians of cartography, we always have to, sometimes we just want to kill that power because we know how fictional it is. We want to drive a stake through the heart of cartography. But maps enjoy amazing authority and amazing legibility. And I think because they toggle very closely between lived experience and an abstraction of that experience that's meaningful on many, many different levels. Imagining worlds without sovereign borders, imagining worlds where we see effects of climate change that are global. I think there are ways that I don't know that hopeful is the way to think about it. I think that we can harness the power of the map to make citizens better educated, and in hopes that they'll make more better decisions. With a map?
Yeah, with some merit between art and map.
That is a good question. Yeah. Oh, yeah. So the question is, in historic cartography, is there any moment where this marriage of art and cartography had kind of positive results, a liberating force? Actually, I'm just drawing on, and I'm glad David Colmenar is, because he can maybe opine on this too. But I think there's some wonderful 19th century maps of Mexico, and of course, when we look back to Benedict Anderson's formulation, he, in his imagined communities, he argued that Latin America was the place where nation states really were successful. That was one of the arguments of his book. And when you look to some of the 19th century maps there, some of which are actually in the Rumsey collection, they use figuration in a way to imagine a multi-ethnic Mexican population. And I'm thinking of Garcia Cubas's maps of in Mexico Pintoresco. They're from the 1890s. And there I actually think, I think those are very powerful maps, because they take the newly decided cartograph, which is Mexico after the Mexican-American War, which lopped off a lot of its territory, but they show the border. They show the image of the Mexican state in the center. And then all around are figurations of the different kind of types. But those include indigenous peoples, they include Creoles who are dancing in the city. And I think actually that there's a very powerful way of thinking about the nation as encompassing a wide variety of peoples in its borders. So I think there are actually some positive moments of that. And I was thinking about that particular map because I love it, but I don't think in the United States we have any map that's like that, that figures what we think of as the nation's people on the edges of the map. And that might be an interesting place to start. What do we think the national population looks like? Yeah, so thank you for that question.
I have a question from the Zoom participants. Javier Rayon asks, he says, "Hi, Professor. Currently, it's hard for the general public to access resources like Cortez's map or the Florentine Codex. What can we do as Mexicans to access and reinterpret today our heritage in meaningful, personal ways?" And he's writing from Mexico City.
So the Florentine Codex is digitized on the World Digital Library. You can have access to every single page of that. You can download the pages. And that's a really wonderful resource. The Getty's site, I think, is going to be up and running if it's not already. And that is multilingual. It's Spanish, English, and Nahuatl. So that's yet another resource that one can use for the Florentine Codex. I will also give a plug for the David Rumsey map collection. Not through the Stanford Libraries, but David Rumsey runs his own Luna database site. And if you search David Rumsey, he's made all of his maps, digitized them at high resolution, including the Cortez map. And you can download those at various resolutions. You can send your students to use the pages, they're there. So those are really fantastic resources to use. And because they're downloadable, you can move them into your own space and you can interpret them in a way that's satisfying to you. And I think the Cortez map is one such map that is merits from more interpretive voices chiming in on it. So those are just two. And if you email me, Mundy at Tulane, I can send you some more ideas because I'd love to be in conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for this wonderful talk. I was really taken by the structure of Indigenous sovereignty out of time and these two different interpretations that you gave. And I think the first interpretation, thinking about how this image of Tenochtitlan became a gift that sort of symbolized this transfer of power, and also this later map in which you have this painted image on the top in which the native sovereigns appear sort of antiquated. And I found very compelling this idea that that this goes hand in hand with a sort of dispossession, right? A sort of showing of native peoples as ancient peoples. And I think of some of the chronicles from the 16th century, right? Where even contemporary descriptions of Indigenous peoples shows them as ancient, right? As a kind of act of dispossession. And so I just wanted to ask you for a little bit more with these contemporary maps and these works of art, because I'm sort of struck how there's this kind of vague, projection of Indigenous peoples into the past in these older maps. And these new maps, I'm sort of struck by how many of the sort of visual materials actually refer to very specific moments, right? So the 1524 Nuremberg map showing up today, and then the images from Sahagún, from the Florentine Codex. So I guess I'm just curious if alongside with this idea of Indigenous sovereignty out of time, just this persistence of specific moments in the past, this kind of collage use of them in contemporary art. I'm just wondering if maybe you could speak a little bit more to that. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I think in the Mariana's work, just go ahead here. She is drawing on this map, which for her is simply like a national icon. And I don't know that she's even thinking about it so much as representing a specific moment in time, because it's become so kind of, it itself has become out of time because of the way it's been reproduced. But what I think is powerful about what she's doing here is that when she originally conceived this piece, the Chinelo, it was just to be Chinelo dancers. She was bringing Chinelo dancers to Berlin to perform a kind of contemporary indigeneity or a contemporary whatever. And then they didn't have quite enough money to do that. But they did have money they didn't have money for transport, but they did have money for installation. So she said, let me make the installation. Let me spend that money on the installation. And that's when she hit on the idea of doing the Cortez map. So it was in some ways a kind of artistic response to not quite enough budget in the right place. But more to the point, what I really like about this is that, these are contemporary costumes. So she's really I think she's resisting this idea to think about indigeneity. And this is a very kind of performative indigeneity, really performative indigeneity. She's resisting the idea to think about that as not being part of the past, not being part of the present. And again, in the initial iteration, they were actually to be performing this in Berlin. And these costumes are really kind of like bright, colorful, kind of kitschy. And again, it's turning the volume up on indigeneity here as a performance, which I think is also a very interesting move. Because in the Mexican context, of course, indigeneity does get performed by people who we would not consider indigenous. And it raises the question of who is indigenous in this circumstance. So, yeah, thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. This is really, really wonderful talk. Can you go back to this? You said it's Europe in women's.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's fabulous. Yeah.
And I think it's actually not Europe, because it includes Scythia and Tartaria, etc. And it seems to be biblical, actually.
Yeah.
And it's sort of, these three sons of Noah. So this is the Japhetic, the family seems to be the case. But what I wanted to question is that this, what you say seems to be sort of, didn't last long.
Mm-hmm.
What I would argue is actually we are actually living in this. This seems to be the harbinger of the new period. It's the imperial sovereignty, and from here comes the Leviathan.
Yes. Yeah.
And so we are actually within that time. But now you are arguing that because of all this climate, etc., change, etc. And I actually inclined to believe in that. So we are actually sort of an out of time, or the national sovereignty is actually out of time.
Yeah. Yeah.
So where did this idea come from? Because,
this idea,
at this time, probably it was not that natural, because it's still, biblical.
Mm-hmm.
It's very much, as you say, like, bird's eye view, because it's religion. The religion is the biggest, the universalizing factor. So, but whatever we call this state, whatever the sovereignty, national sovereignty, is really sort of particularized, and it's also not, it's also selective. Valerie Kilson has really a nice map of Remezos map. Even though there was a border, I don't know if Remezov know the border, but it's the map of the people.
Yeah.
That's the ethnographic map.
Yeah.
That's also sort of, bird's eye view thing.
Mm-hmm.
So, and the sovereignty, in my understanding, has two dimensions. One is just the rulership, or what we call May government. The other is this proprietary dimension.
Right.
And because of the Westphalian and Lockean logic of proprietorship, we ended up having, on the land. man owns the land, not as you say, the land would own the people.
Yeah.
Because if the sovereign is the earth or the nature, that sovereign owns us.
Yeah, and this is, I think these maps are kind of rare. They crop up in this very particular moment. They don't seem to extend. They don't have a lifetime. I think that there might be, there's, I think, two possible sources. One, scholars think that this is coming from this idea of Europe itself, Christian Europe, as being a kind of a body, a sovereign body, a unified body, and so Europe as Christian Europe as a unified body. But it's interesting to think about the long history of that into the present day. But second, I think, is that this idea of sticking the map on the body, we find it, again, going back to those earlier biblical maps where we have the sons of Noah being represented on the map. We have maps like a Harrisford map where Christ's body is in the background of the map. So there are these biblical evocations of territory as being sacred body. And I think that's probably one of the origins of this particular map. I think it's, though, compelling to think why it doesn't survive this particular figuration, although the idea does of the transcendent royal bodies existing throughout, even beyond death. And I think that has everything to do with gender, in that, you're opening up this female body to the kind of visible touch, which is an unsustainable proposition, particularly when you start having female monarchs. So, as you do with Elizabeth, yeah. But it's, yeah. Again, you could say maybe this is the European Union, or maybe this is NATO. The seeds are there.
Just a quick comment. There's a wonderful installation over at the Anderson Collection right now. Wendy Red Star of the Montana Crow has her installation up there at Anderson. And she's brought up a map of North America and utilized that. She's utilized some older artwork that she converted into a paint by numbers and blew up and had students collaborate on. So as we're talking about Indigenous artists in current modern times, it's yet another example or a set of examples that are over at Anderson right now.
Thank you. Can you tell us the dates that's going to be up?
It's up right now, and it'll be up through close to the end of August.
Great. Thank you.
And it's fairly small, but it's very striking.
Good. Thank you.
Well, maybe we should thank our speaker for a very long Q&A and a wonderful talk. What an elegant note on which to end the day. Really appreciate it very much. Thank you. Well, I look forward to seeing many of you again tomorrow. The fun continues.